Hi all, my name is Arjun and I would be speaking about the Soviet Union or Russia. The capital of the Russian Federation is Moscow. The western part of Russia is situated within Eastern Europe, one quarter of the whole area. It is called the European part of Russia. The territory situated to the east of the Urals, three quarters of the whole area, is the Asiatic part of Russia. Russia is bounded to the north and east by the Arctic and Pacific Oceans, and it has small frontages in the northwest of the Baltic Sea at St. Petersburg and at the detached Russian Oblast. Mongolia and Kazakhstan and North Korea and China are the south side of the Russian borders, and to the north they share Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Estonia, and a little part of Finland and Norway as well. The Russian Empire lost territories with about 30 million inhabitants after the Russian Revolution. World War II losses were estimated between 27 to 30 million, including an increase in infant mortality rate of 1.3 million. Total war losses include territories annexed by Soviet Union in 1939 to 1945. Although the population growth rate decreased over time, it remained positive throughout the history of the Soviet Union in all republics. And the population grew each year by more than 2 million except during the periods of wartime or any famine. According to the data from the 1989 Soviet census, the population of the Soviet Union was 70% East Slavics, 12% Turkish people, and other ethnic groups were below 10%. Alongside the atheist majority of 60%, there were sizable minorities of Russian Orthodox Christians, approximately 20%, and Muslims as well, about approximately 15%. The current population is exceeding 300 million. Life expectancy at birth, it's about, for male it's 65 years and female it is 75 years. Leadership styles. The years of autocratic leadership throughout Russia's history make leadership in Russia a complex issue, as employees are often afraid and uncomfortable with taking initiatives and responsibilities, since this has traditionally been discouraged and even punished. The history of rule under various autocratic leaders has also created a substantial generation gap between those who have spent most of their life in the Soviet system and those who have grown up in the new Russia. The new Russia possesses many challenges for both older generation, which now has to unlearn its business practices, and the younger generation, which must adopt to the new and changing circumstances. The biggest problem for Western states or expatriates are they must deal with numerous difficulties operating in Russia. And for the companies or the enterprise that come from foreign in Russia, is the interaction between the Western managers and the Russian employees is a threat. Underline the significance of lack of knowledge on how successfully to operate in Russia. There is a need for further insight into how to successfully manage business in Russia, and argue that possessing these expertise is a distinct advantage. Amongst the other challenges, the volatility of the Russian market, an issue that forces firms to be more long-term oriented. Moreover, that Russian leadership issues are under-researched, and that it is important to further understand the idiosyncrasies of leadership in Russia. National culture can impact on attitudes to empowerment. During the Soviet period, a culture of fear developed in Russia. Change has been slow, and this culture still affects organization there. In order for organization and business in Russia to develop, it necessary to find a way for managers and employees to embrace organizational changes. However, currently there exists a preference for routine in Russia and a general reluctancy towards taking responsibility. Moving on to the economic conditions that exists in Russia, the USSR was planned command economy, which operated under conditions of capital scarcity with state ownership of the means of production. Production was directed towards and not towards sale and profit. Full employment of labor was constitutionally guaranteed. The state had the monopoly of foreign trade. Central planning allocated resources for the entire production process. In the USSR, the economic activities was defined and subordinated to the instructions from the above. The plan was imperative. As Stalin said in 1979, plans are not forecasts but instructions. In both its design and implementation stages, central planning is based on the hierarchical pattern of national economy, which turn presupposes obedience and discipline. The central planning organ in the Soviet Union was Gosplan, which means State Planning Commission. The Gosplan was in charge of the elaborate of the production plans. The pricing system was administered, and the Gosplan defined goals of physical production of the whole economy. There are 4 key points that we can look into or summarize the economy with. Economic growth was greater thanks to the investment. They spent a lot in military or armed forces. Level of personal consumption of substances, concentrating mainly on food, clothing, and housing. Public consumption spent well on health, education, other social and cultural services. As a command economy, Soviet was characterized by a resource mobilization towards rapid industrialization. In the Soviet economy system, a priority was given to the allocation of investment to producers' goods and industries rather than consumer good ones. This strategy was very clear as far back as it started with the first 5-year plan, which was implemented in 1928 and lasted till 1933. As increase in the rate of growth of economy demands industrialization, heavy industry, machine industry, and building and electrification. The Soviet economy was heavily militarized because the country was constantly confronted with hostility of the other foreign powers, and especially the United States and China after 1960. This militarization of economy had strong structural implications. The entire production of key sectors was controlled by the VPK, the Soviet Military Industry Commission. Thus, most technological innovations and scientific breakthroughs were generally first allocated to the military use. Many industries were designed to be able to switch from civilian activity to the production of military equipment in a short notice. Similarly, many products such as transportation equipment, aircraft, trucks had to be a dual use, both military and civilian. The geographic dispersion of industry complexes was decided for the strategy, not economic reasons. The existence of large stocks of inventories was also necessary in this context of a permanent war economy. The first phase, from the 1950s to the beginning of 1970, corresponds to a regime of extensive accumulation of capital with increased rates of investments and fast growth of output and the per capita GDP. Thus, the average annual per capita GDP rate was 3.6% during this period. As a structural change with large transfer of labor from agriculture to industry and technical progress incorporated in new machinery happened. Agricultural production made a lot of progress during this period. The external trade structure of the Soviet was marked by the limited size of the foreign trade with the capitalist countries. The emphasis of heavy industry, capital goods, and weapons were assumed by the Soviet leaderships. Besides, Stalin, from 1951 to 1972, wrote that the national economy of the Soviet cannot be continuously expanded without giving primacy to the production of means of production. In 1928, goods formed 60.5% of the Soviet industry output, and different goods, that is, the capital goods, constituted about 39.5%. In 1950, the proportion was reverted and consumer goods formed 31.2% and the capital good formed 68.8%. The economy trajectory of the Soviet from 1950 to 1991 was very contrasting. The success of the Soviet extensive growth model in the 1950s and 1960s was undeniable. But the depletion of the large reserves of underemployed rural workforce and low-cost natural resources were responsible for the exhaustion of this model. A phase of economic stagnation began in 1970s. The attempt to move a new regime of intensive accumulation with high productivity growth to overcome the new constraints failed. The deterioration of labor discipline, the militarization of the economy, both in what regards large expenditures because of the Cold War and the problems, the industry structure and diffusion of technical progress, and the great difficulties with cold weather agriculture were all partly responsible. It is interesting to observe how structural characteristics of the Soviet economy influenced post-Soviet Russia. Thus, the predatory practices which began thanks to the Perestroika reforms became generalized during the period of transition to the capitalism in the 1990s. The wealth acquired by Soviet state managers during the Perestroika allowed them to take advantage of the shock therapy reforms in 1990. They were not known as Russian oligarchs. The current Russia is also characterized by the low productivity, agriculture, growing dependence on raw materials and energy exports, a structural external vulnerability inherited from the Soviet times, which virtually free short-term capital mobility has been added. Moving on to the political system and the political structure that existed in Soviet Union. The governing body of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, also known as CPSU, was the Party Congress, which initially met annually but whose meetings became less frequent, particularly under Joseph Stalin. Party Congress would elect a central committee, which in turn would elect a Politburo. Under Stalin, the most powerful position in the party became the General Secretary, who was elected by the Politburo. In 1952, the title of the General Secretary became First Secretary, and the Politburo became the Presidium before reverting to their former names under Leonid Benzikhev in 1966. The Council of Members or Ministers acted to the executive body of the government. Its most important duty lay in the administration of the economy. This council, which in 1989 included more than 100 members, is too large and unwieldy to act as a unified executive body. The council's presidium, made up the leading economic administrator and led by the chairman, exercised dominant power within the council of members. According to the constitution as amended in 1988, the highest legislative body in the Soviet Union was the Congress of People's Deputies, which convened for the first time in May 1989. The main tasks of the Congress were the elections of the standing legislature, the Supreme Soviet, and the election of the chairman of the Supreme Soviet, who acted as the head of state. The government lacked an independent judiciary. The Supreme Court supervised the lower courts and applied the law as established by the Constitution or as interpreted by the Supreme Soviet. The Constitutional Oversight Committee reviewed the constitutionality of law and acts on a regular basis. The Russian Soviet Republic was proclaimed on 7th November 1917. That was the duration when October Revolution happened. As a sovereign state and the world's first constitutionally socialist state with the ideology of communism, the first constitution was adopted in 1918. In 1922, the Russia SFSR signed the Treaty of Creation of the USSR. The 1977 Soviet Commission stated Union Republic is a sovereign state that has united in the Union, and each Union Republic shall retain the right freely to secede from the USSR. On 12th June 1990, the Congress of People's Deputies adopted the Declaration of State Sovereignty, established separation of powers instead of Soviet forms of government, established citizenship of Russia, and stated that the Russia or the sovereign state shall retain the right for free successor from the USSR. On 12th June 1991, Boris Yeltsin was elected the first president supported by the Democratic Russia pro-reform movement. Now moving on to the industries industries in the Soviet era that existed. In the Soviet era, there were giant factories that were like communities. They produced housing, schools, hospitals for their work. Industries, towns were created from the scratch around the resources in the Urals and the Siberia. Economic initiatives were given to people to go and work there. Russian economies and business boomed. The communist government supported heavy industries such as steel making, heavy machine making, and large infrastructure projects. In the Urals, there was an enterprise that made oil rigs, steel foundries, and earth movers that moved 100 tons of earth with one move. Some firms produced an illogical array of goods such as cooking pans, washing machines, and high-performance aircraft. But that is not to say the Soviet Union didn't make its share of consumer goods. In the early 1990s, the former Soviet Union made the most refrigerators, about 6 million a year, and socks, almost a billion a year, in the world. It was also made a lot of televisions. The top 5 television producers per year in 1988 were Japan, USA, former Soviet Union, South Korea, and China. A primitive industrialized society was established at a huge cost, namely in terms of population, inefficiency, and poor production. Industries were heavily subsidized and profits were not regarded as an important consideration. The production cost of a Dresden produced Patika camera, for instance, was 3 times the selling price. Products were often shoddy. Russian stuff was a common expletive used in Eastern European to describe flat tires and broken down refrigerators. Industry in post-Soviet Russia. In the 1990s, Russian industries was in the terrible shape. Factories were filled with outdated machinery, and there was no capital to retool and restructure them. Some Russian factories and smelters were equipped with machineries taken from the Germany as repartitions after World War II. Industry production of Russia fell 50% between 1991 to 1996, a sharper decline than in the United States during the Depression. Many factories were dark before they couldn't pay their electric bills. Many of them operated run at less than 1% of capacity. Successful industries increased productivity, improved marketing, trimmed waste, laid off unproductive workers, lowered their levels of debt, and increased flexibility. In some regions, the government took control stake in debt-ridden industries and implemented solid business practices and then sold the companies to the investors. Moving on to the labor unions in Soviet Russia. Labor unions in Russia, as at present constituted, are less than 20 years old. Before the revolution of 1905, there was very little economic organization among the workers and it was illegal. During the revolution of 1905, actually paid membership in the professional unions was about 50,000, and the reaction of 1906 outlawed them entirely. The Russian unions are artificial development. They were designed by intellectuals who made a scientific study of the labor organization in different countries, constructed on the paper the ideal labor union, in this case a combination of the French syndicates with the German trade union system, and applied it into Russia. The Russian unions, however, are industry unions. Carpenters who make the gun carriages are members of the metalwork unions. This was not enough for Russian workers in revolution. Although the large number of joined the unions, still open shops existed. Many workers could not see the necessity for organizing and the struggle between the working mass and the boss of industries was confused and dead-ended by the unions. At the present time, the function of the professional unions is a standardized wages, hours, and constituents thought out each industry and to maintain laboratories for efficiency and labor-saving experiments. But the professional unions occupy a secondary role in the organization of Russian industrial workers. The precedence belongs to another organization, a product of the conditions of the revolution themselves, of the factory and the shop committee. Now moving on to the final part or the final portion, that is the ethics and culture that existed in the Soviet state. The main features of communist attitudes towards arts and artists in the year 1918 to 1921 was relative freedom and significant experimentation with several different styles in an effort to find a distinctive Soviet style of art. In many respects, a time of relative freedom and experimentation for the social and cultural life of the Soviet Union. The government tolerated a variety of trends in these fields, provided they were not overly hostile to the regime. In art and literature, numerous schools, some traditions, and other radical experimental proliferated. Communist writers Max Gorky, Vladimir Mayakovsky were active during this time. But other authors, many of whose work were later repressed, published work lacking socialist political content. Film as a means of influencing a large illiterate society received encouragement from the state. Much of cinematography, Sergio Einstein's best works, dates from this period. Under Stalin's era, arts were characterized by the rise and dominance of the government-imposed style of socialist realism, with all other trends being severely repressed, with the rare expectations. In addition to literature, The musical expression was also repressed during the Stalin era, and at times the music of many Soviet composers was banned altogether. For example, Dmitri was the first person experienced a particularly long and complex relationship with Stalin, during which his music was denounced and prohibited twice in 1936 and in 1948. Sergei and Aram Chalturan had similar cases. Although Igor Stravinsky did not live in the Soviet Union, his music was officially considered formalist and anti Soviet. In the 1960s, 70s, and the 80s, the Brezhnev era, a distinctive period of Soviet culture, developed, characterized by the conformist public life and intense focus on personal life. In late Soviet Union, Soviet popular culture was characterized by fascination with American pop culture as exemplified by the blue jeans craze. Thank you.